det simple fokus med Elfie Cherney and Dominic Gilda for live enjoying.
Hi, and welcome to this new episode. Please welcome your hosts, Elfie Cherney and Dominic Godat.
Welcome back, everyone. We are very excited to be here today with Jennifer Gerwing and Sara Healing via Zoom. Hello, the two of you.
Hello.
Hi. We visited you more than a year ago on Vancouver Island, had such a great time with you and learned so many things. And we're so happy that we can have you on our podcast before we leave North America and go back to Europe again.
Yeah, it's fun to be here.
Yeah.
North America will miss you.
I guess North America is missing you from time to time as well, Jennifer.
Yeah, Jennifer, you are at the Akershus University Hospital in Oslo as senior researcher and are there sometimes in Vancouver Island and doing work with Sara Healing and Janet Bavalis. And Sara, you're a researcher with Janet Bavalis and you're both are part of the International Microanalysis Associates. And we have talked about that several times in our podcast. It's such an important work and we're so thrilled to debunk some myth of communication today with you.
Well, the two of you are also working very closely together, and we heard some amazing stories about how you work on Zoom together, like just sitting next to each other. So we were very excited to have the two of you sitting together and the two of us on Zoom, and we're curious what will emerge out of our conversation today.
So to start with, what fascinates you two with face-to-face dialogue?
I'm fascinated with how many people have to use face-to-face dialogue as their main tool that they work with. And there's so many professions that use it. While there's a lot that we know, like from social sciences and studies on language use, sometimes some of that doesn't make it into institutional dialogues. So when doctors and patients, or teachers and students, or therapists and clients, it's such important work that you do using conversation, and I'm fascinated by knowing about that.
And I think that as I started to study face-to-face dialogue and look carefully, I became more and more fascinated with the coordination that it takes and the skill that each person in their dialogue has in their ability to coordinate with the person they're talking to. And I know that fascination has sort of gotten bigger and bigger recently with having really young kids, that seeing how at such a young age they learn how to look at your face when you're saying words and tell when you're joking or when you're very serious, and seeing them learn gestures and how they integrate that with their speech, and just see that skill and how it starts at such a young age. And we're not that conscious of it, I don't think, but that you can see that it is something very skilled that we do every day in conversations of all sorts of different types of importance. And that has sort of inspired me to want to know more and more how we do it. I can see that we do it, but understanding how we do it and seeing the processes by which it happens, it leaves a lot of questions for me, which is exciting.
And seeing how it happens, Jennifer, you said there's so much knowledge out there, and there's also so much out there that is just not really how it works or what is visible and observable. And we would love to debunk some myths of communication with you. Janet told us when we were there that she would love to give a training for communication and earn like $10,000 and just go in there and say, just behave naturally.
That's so true. Yeah. At the same time, though, we behave naturally, like when we're ordering food at a restaurant or when we meet people for coffee. There's a very natural, easy way that we coordinate our actions. But also, if it's a helping profession, like in healthcare, there's all sorts of extra things added on that change the dialogue in some fundamental ways, like issues of responsibility and knowledge and all the cognitive work that's going on for doctors and nurses when they're working with patients. And so it's interesting to me how they can navigate interaction and navigate the contingency in interaction while paying attention to a lot of very detailed knowledge and working with that. So I think that's something that, I try to be very respectful in my work, which brings out the idea of myths, because when they get advice, say about nonverbal communication or things like that, and the advice isn't congruent with how communication works, I think it really interferes with the whole process that they're using to do their job. So they could be be paying attention to the wrong things.
So tell us more about some of the myths that you can just debunk with the work you do in microanalysis, and instead of recommending things that are not there, really recommending things that are valuable for them and are helping them to have good interactions.
So when I was doing my master's thesis, I worked quite closely with doctors who were dealing with patient care. And we talked quite a lot about communication just as part of our conversations leading up to our work together. And one of the things that they would talk about is how as doctors, they were taught very specific things that they needed to do during their conversations with their patients. I'll give you an example of a few of them they said they were told to sit in a neutral position, which meant they had to have both their feet on the ground. They need to have the hands on their lap, sitting in sort of a relaxed posture. And actually, in particular, we were talking about conversations where you'd be delivering bad news to a patient, and they were taught to maintain eye contact with the patient while they were delivering the bad news.
And it could be fun for the listeners of your podcast to adopt this posture of feet flat on the floor, hands on knees, leaning slightly forward, staring at whoever they're talking to.
And then they had to give bad news about a diagnosis of cancer. And many of the physicians anecdotally said that they didn't like this, or that they weren't good at doing this, or that they just ignored the advice because they found it very awkward. So we helped them by talking to them about what evidence there was for those kind of behaviors. So I think probably the one that stuck out to me the most was the eye contact. They were told as the speaker to, while they were giving bad news, maintain eye contact with the patient. And what we know from research is that the gaze between speaker and whoever they're talking to is what is used to regulate turn taking in a conversation. So the normal pattern of gaze is one where the speaker, when they're delivering information, is often looking away from the person. And then the way that they get feedback from the person they're delivering the information to is they bring their gaze towards that person at specific times, and then that will signal to the patient or addressee to nod or to give feedback that they're following along. And the addressee, the person that they're speaking to, the patient, they normally are staring at the doctor or the speaker. And that's how they notice. As soon as the doctor's gaze starts to come towards them, then they're able to respond. So what was happening when the doctors were being given this advice of maintaining eye contact is that it was conflicting with the normal gaze pattern. And if you try it sometime, the doctors and I tried it. If you try as the speaker, you give information staring at the person, it's very, very awkward and off-putting. And in my experience, when I was person pretending to be the patient, when we were trying to do a role play of this, I had to look away. I couldn't look at the doctor while they were doing it. So that's an example of one of the myths that's out there, that you should maintain eye contact when you're the speaker, when it's actually normally the addressee that maintains eye contact.
And this and other things that you show also on your website, I see connected to the idea that body language is separate from spoken language and not part of it. And with the work you do, you show that facial gestures, hand gestures, gaze is part of our speaking, our interactions together, and that it contributes to what we say compared to these ideas that the body has kind of completely different language.
Yeah, this is a very prevalent myth that's out there, sort of pop psychology sort of way of thinking about what the body's doing. And, in fact, the way we use our bodies and our face and our gaze in interaction, they're making remarkable contributions when we're talking. Like, we use our hand gestures and our body to enact ourselves or other people, or we can show shapes and sizes and portray lots of things with our hands and body. We can use our face to show many, many different things. This all works in conjunction with our speech, and it's like one whole system together.
I mean, I very well remember when Dominic and I did the microanalysis course with you, you showed us a video where a person was talking to someone and took his right hand, making the
Telephone
sign of a phone and putting his hand to the ear. So it was for everyone who saw the video obvious that he was talking on the telephone and not just talking in the same room with someone.
I have to say that it's really super fun to talk about gestures in a podcast.
You should see us how we gesture with our hands, and we should make a video of that podcast.
Yeah, exactly.
For me, this was a very interesting thing because honestly, I never ever heard that before in any of the books. And I read quite some books on communication during my time at the university and even later because I was always fascinated by that.
Yeah, and sort of the myth that we find we have to confront in our work is this idea that the body is like this separate channel of communication. They call it like the non-verbal channel. So like it's the rational, conscious thing that we're doing. doing. And then our bodies are the emotional, subconscious part of our message. And that somehow these are separable. So that when there's discrepancies, it's suggested that you should look at what the body is doing because the body is somehow leaking the truth of the matter. But in fact, usually people mobilize these resources together to be congruent with each other.
And how do you see that, or also how can you show that?
Well, we use very fine-grained analysis techniques, not just us, but there's a huge body of gesture research, a smaller body of research on faces, yeah. But basically, we look at videos and we do frame-by-frame analysis. And if you capture exactly where gestures occur and you look at the speech that goes with the gesture, you can sort of see how they're working together. And you can map out what is the gesture contributing, what is the speech contributing. So it's about synchrony. It's about synchrony and timing and in meaning.
Yeah, and the same thing with the face. There's been some really interesting work done where they've seen lots and lots of different various functions for the face. Like eyebrows can be used to mark words, emphasize words. So when I say eyebrows, I mean like eyebrows going up. It can be used to emphasize words. It can be used to underline things in a sentence. And then also can be used to show shock or surprise. And there's lots of functions for different parts of the face. You can really see those functions when you're looking at them in conjunction with the words. And it's very much comes down, I think, to the timing of those gestures with the words. People who've looked at faces and looked at them more as conduits to the person's emotions are often talking about a process that would be much more global, more general. And, you know, if you're feeling sad, presumably you'd be feeling sad for a long period of time. And you shouldn't be seeing it flashing on and off with certain words timed exactly with someone describing somebody else being sad, for example. So yeah, the evidence I think comes from looking very closely at conversation and how the face and gestures are working in conjunction with the speech. That's not to say that people don't have emotions or feelings that you can sometimes see on their face. What we found is that what people are doing most of the time with their face is this co-speech gestures, co-speech facial displays.
I think Jan was just noticing in some of her recent work on smiles and conversation, and the pragmatic use of that it was a storyteller who was using a smile. She looked at the words that went along with the smile during the story, and those words were ones that would become really important for the narrative later. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't smiling to show happiness or laughter or something. It was actually marking something that was important for the discourse.
Wow, that's very cool.
So the speaker smiling during certain words, indicating the importance of the word.
Yeah, they would become important later. It was like foreshadowing where the story was going.
Cool. Yeah, and I think this is also one of the very important things we're talking here, that we never can put gestures and then facial expressions out of the context. And I think this is what you very much highlight throughout your whole work.
Yeah, everything we study, we're always making conclusions about that thing within the context that it occurs at that moment. And the same movement of the face could have a totally different meaning in a different context. Even the same combination of word and facial display or gesture could have a different meaning in a different type of conversation between two different people. So even if you took the same combination of word and gesture, if it was in a conversation with two different people in a different section of the conversation, it could have a different meaning.
And I think this is such an important message because people still so much believe in this general topics of body language. And there are so many books on the market highlighting that, and they're super popular, which is kind of crazy seeing microanalysis of face-to-face dialogue showing something completely different.
I know when I tell people that I study communication, the first thing that most people ask me if I study is body language. It seems to be the thing that has the most popularity.
Well, it's fun because, it's very appealing to think that if you know some tips and tricks about body language, that you can become an expert and have some secret knowledge about the people around you. I just think it's kind of fun and appealing, but it's not rooted in any scientific research at all.
And Jana told us a story that you lost 3 years on trying to see mirroring. There's so much out there that's just not observable. And like all this, if you cross your arms, this means this. If you do this, this means this. And it's just not the way it is. And it's really interesting for us to see and also find ways to talk about it, that your work, the interactional view and really looking very closely at interactions, how interactions unfold and how people cooperate split second by split second is such an important work. And the question is, how can we make that more visible, and how could that also be shown that it is useful in so many different fields, like you said, in the medical field, for example, or in every field where communication is part of the job, and also, of course, in private life?
I don't know how we can make it more visible except just to put the commercial message out there whenever we have the opportunity. Like Sarah said, when you say you talk about communication, then people want to know about body language. Similarly, even at my workplace, I think I've got them all up to speed now. You know, if I gave a talk about gestures, hand gestures, because I've studied physicians' gestures and now physicians and patients' gestures. But when I give that talk, the first thing I hear from people when they hear the talk title, or if I meet them in the hallway, is, oh yeah, apparently like 92% of communication is nonverbal. And like these notions, they're very strong in people's imagination. And so I just try whenever possible to just say, well, actually, it's not that way. You know, this is a misinterpretation of an old study, and I don't think we need to get into the study, but it's just a misinterpretation of some work that was out there. And then I say, well, actually, no, we can't divide up by percentages what people are doing visibly and what they're doing audibly. It doesn't make sense to do that. If you show people examples on video of what people are actually doing, that's really quite interesting enough.
I was going to say that I think when you're asking, like, what is the way to get people to shift, I would say that if people were interested in learning more about it, to study a videotape, to look at people actually communicating and look at what they're doing with their faces or their gestures. Because I think when you actually look at what's happening, you can see that it's not the same as what you read in the popular literature about body language. You could watch a conversation between a physician and a patient, and I'm sure you could find an example where one person has their arms crossed, but you can tell that the conversation is very collegial and that they're open and talking freely with each other. I think when you actually start to look at video, a lot of those myths sort of are busted quite quickly. So I think for people who are using it as their tool, it's worth getting video and studying and appreciating how they do what they do.
And it's also important how you look at the videos and kind of what perspective you take. And we know in Solution Focus that we see things that we focus on and we don't see other things. And we had this beautiful challenge in the podcast number 10 with Janet Bavlis, where she said one should watch a conversation between two people and just try to imagine what person is thinking and what is going on in the person, and then go and drink a coffee and come back and watch the same interaction and just look at the interaction on all the things that are observable, how people cooperate, and you see something completely different.
And this challenge actually came from you, Jennifer, right?
I recognized it when I heard it, yeah.
She quoted you very well. So maybe you can tell us how you came up with this idea of inviting people to do such an exercise.
I think it's easiest for people to understand that if they contrast different ways of looking at things. And we sort of felt like if we wanted to contrast the way we do our research and the way we do analysis, which is to look at observable behaviors, to look at specific behaviors, and to look at behaviors in interaction, if that's our focus, that can be really abstract unless you contrast it with what's the alternative. So you can either look at behaviors in interaction or as individual things. So if you're looking at a conversation, you can just sort of look at what one individual is doing with, say, nodding, which, you know, we're all nodding to each other quite a bit here, we can see. You can say, okay, that person's nodding a lot. Maybe they're nodding too much. Why did they nod there? And you would just think about individual behaviors. But if you look at those behaviors in interaction, you find out, oh, well, they're nodding a lot because the speaker's looking at them a lot right now. And their nods are timed with when the speaker looks at them. So it's something in the interaction that's going on that you only see if you really focus on that.
Yeah, when we look differently, then we also see other things differently, not only speaking, but also listening, for example.
Yeah, there's a lot of myths around listening or ways of thinking about listening that aren't very helpful. There's an idea that if you're just listening, it's just in the background and it doesn't really matter how you do it. And this comes from this sort of myth that dialogue is like, I take my turn and then you take your turn, and this sort of turn-taking, alternating monologues model of dialogue. it leads to ideas like that listening is just something that happens in the background. But if you look really closely at listening, if you're doing a microanalysis of listening behaviors, and there's lots of people who've studied conversation look at this, you find out there's no such thing as neutral listening. There's no such thing as it going on in the background without affecting the speaker. So things like every time you nod or say mm-hmm or do these little kind of behaviors that are supposed to be not having an effect, it's supposed to be just non-directive, they actually exert a very strong force in the dialogue, because when somebody nods, the speaker will respond to the nod by continuing to give more new information. So nodding is just like a little motor behind the speaker, helping the speaker to contribute more and more information. And this becomes, thanks for that.
Thanks for nodding. Or what?
I mean, it's interesting to think about how does this apply, say, in medical dialogues or healthcare dialogues. And I can think of one example, a very concrete example. So I was working with somebody who was working with resident physicians. So like physicians who were having to record their conversations with patients, and the physicians would come in for their video review with things that they wanted to ask about, things that didn't go right. And so one of them came in and said, well, this patient kept talking and talking and talking about, whatever, and I didn't know how to stop them. Look at the video. In fact, the physician was driving that behavior because she kept nodding and she kept saying, mm-hmm. And every time she does that, then the patient's going to go on and continue, because that's what they're doing together. She's being encouraged to do that, and she's doing that. She's participating. So even knowing those little things about how conversation works can really apply in everyday practice.
It's also one thing your article, Listener as Co-Narrator, shows that listening is really important for the storyteller and how they tell the story, or in your example now, how they go on and go on, or how they stop and cannot go on because there's no nodding or no eye contact or whatever.
Yeah, I always think that that's a good one for people to know, especially people where their listening might be particularly important, because if for some reason you're distracted, or if for some reason you're needing to attend to two different things and you aren't able to do appropriate listener responses at the appropriate time, it can have an effect on the person who's trying to give you the information. Like, I think one of the things that comes with this idea that it's something that's in the background and isn't that important is that perhaps you forget to put in as much energy into it as is actually needed, and you downplay your role in the conversation. And, when you're, for example, a doctor and you're listening to a patient and they're giving you information, if you're not paying enough attention to the interaction and that's causing the patient to not give you some information that's important, that could be very detrimental.
So what is a good listening?
Oh, what is good listening? That's a very good question, because I think if you have a helping profession, good listening is listening that helps you to do your job and helps you to take care of the client or the patient. And I don't know if you could say, do this or do that will make you a good listener. And that's what kind of disrupts the whole process. So if people are more concentrated on being an active listener and doing the right listening technique, well, then they're not really paying attention to the client anymore. They're paying attention to their own behavior. So some of learning about how behaviors actually work in interaction is learning how to get the new schema, how to see how things work, and then kind of let go of that and just pay attention to the interaction and pay attention to the client.
Yeah, I think this is one of the places where Jan's, when she was commenting on someone would pay her a lot of money and she would go in and say, just listen naturally, like the way that you would listen if you were listening to something that's very important. And obviously to be watching the patient or the client, then you're showing them that you're following along, and you also can see their actions, their faces, their gestures. But otherwise, let go of all the other things you've heard about listening and listen the way that we have all practiced and learned over many years of communicating with people.
There's also this sort of thing that happens with doctors and patients of, I don't know how to characterize it except to say kind of pretend listening. And I don't mean that to be disparaging at all. It's just that doctors have a lot of things to do when they're talking to the patient. They might have to be typing into the patient record. They're thinking about how they're going to put these symptoms together into something that makes sense. And I think when they're doing those things, when they're typing on the computer, when they're doing these activities of practice that aren't related to the interaction at that moment, it's sometimes better to not pretend to be listening at that moment, and better to maybe just make that a little bit of a topic and say, just hang on a second, I'm going to type this. so that they're not sitting there and nodding and looking like they're listening while they're typing or something, because they have to attend to this other activity that they really need to do, but they should maybe just take themselves out of that interaction for that moment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So we do it all naturally when we just listen, and we do it all naturally when we just speak with each other and are in interaction and interested in the interaction or in what we say.
Yeah,
I
like
think as long as we pay attention, right? This is what I got out.
pay attention and try and have gaze be like, make sure that as a listener, you're able to watch what the person's doing. But I think, like, I was thinking, if we went back to some of the myths, like when I think about the origins of that posture that I was telling you about, where you have your hands on your legs and you have your body in a certain position and you're orienting towards the person, I think that those came out of like a good idea. They came from the idea of we need people to pay attention to the other person. But I sort of see the problem with it is that if you make it so rigid that I have to be sitting in a certain position, then I am focusing on that and not the conversation. Like, I'm not at the right level in the conversation. And so I think it's totally fine to say, yeah, you should be looking at the person. You should be orienting yourself to them, listening to what they're saying. But if there's other things about communication that are sort of flooding your mind, that might be distracting your ability to pay attention to the interaction and what the other person's saying.
So the two of you spent hours and hours analyzing face-to-face dialogue second by second or millisecond by millisecond. How many hours do you think is it still countable?
Crazy amount of hours. The thing is, when you start looking really closely and you're working with video, when we were doing the project on calibration, we actually had to set an alarm on our phones to stop ourselves, because when you get into it, 90 minutes, 2 hours goes by and you don't even notice because you're just absorbed. So we would set our clock so that every hour we would stand up. We've been working together quite a few years, maybe 15 years now.
I can't even guess.
It's fun though.
Well, this is a sense we got seeing you, and then also the three of you in your office at Janet's house. There is really great work to be done by people who enjoy what they do, who love what they do, and who have a lot of respect and appreciation for each other. So I'm still curious, like looking back on those 15 years you say working together and like being really deep into microanalysis, how did your displays of listening maybe change, or how did your, behaviors around communication change?
I mean, you can notice a few things when you're in the moment and you're having a conversation with someone. I generally notice it when there's something special that happens. Like, so I might notice somebody's like really cool gesture they use. I will often notice when things break down. I might notice why that is. But I find for me, I generally try and not bring my microanalysis to my conversations that I have with people, because I also don't want to become that distracted listener who's thinking about microanalysis and not listening to the person. But what it has helped for me is to give me a language for a lot of the things that people describe to me, problems people have. It's given me a language so that I can talk to people. Like with Jennifer and I, because we worked together for a long time, we can have very different conversations about communication than I can have with other people. But it's given me a language and words, and I love being able to teach other people and be able to describe things more precisely than just say like nonverbal communication or body language, which was a lot of other people use.
It does give us the possibility of having extremely geeky conversations when things go wrong, because when we realize we've had a misunderstanding or something, and then like we just think it's about 100 times more hilarious than most people would think, because we can see exactly what happened.
Exactly. The postmortem of misunderstandings are really cool.
So you start enjoying misunderstandings much more.
Oh, I love misunderstandings. Actually, with my work, I work in Norway a lot of the time, so I'm almost always dealing with conversations where we don't have a common first language. So like a lot of the people I speak with, they speak English really extremely well, but it's still their second language or third even, because they're very clever. And there's so many interesting misunderstandings you can have, even if you are speaking quite fluently. I have a very strong interest in that in my own work as well.
I would be very curious to see a video of a interaction 15 years ago and now. At least this is what I see, what changed for me over the years learning about microanalysis. I did not grow up with the interactional view. I very much believed in inner concepts, and during my studies of economics and human resource management, I learned a lot about postmodern ideas, but also a lot about all these personality tests and things like that. And through microanalysis, I really learned to get the idea of interaction in a whole different way. And I started to see, and I'm at the very beginning, I told you a story earlier. So I still see myself as a very beginner in that, but yet I'm seeing much more interaction than I ever did before. And I think this definitely changed my behavior. I perceive myself much more as an interactional person. I listen in a different way for sure, because microanalysis really gave me tools to listen in a different way, to listen for, well, I love to call it to listen for the brilliance of people, and then nodding at different times. And by that, having completely different conversations, even with people that are close to me. And I'd only looked at some of the videos, right? I didn't analyze them. I mean, maybe 10 hours or something of videos in the course we had. But even I think those 10 hours made such a huge difference for me that I cannot thank you enough for changing my perspectives on conversations, on communications, and also on the way how I view the world.
That's exciting.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, I think these are some of the benefits that people can have when they get into microanalysis or more into an interactional view. I don't think that they have to do the actual microanalysis. As soon as people engage in this way of looking at conversations and also engage in all the resources that are out there, and we'll post the resource that you have on your website and the studies that you made in our resource section of our podcast so that people who are interested can read more about that. As soon as people get into that, we see things change. And Sarah, you said you have different language. They start talking differently about the interaction. They're seeing things differently. And I think these are some of the benefits. What other benefits do you think could people get when they know more about what you do and the way you look at interactions?
I think you've said a lot of it very nicely. Both of you have just this sense of being able to see your interactions in a new light and have a new repertoire for explaining how things are going and for understanding your role in what's happening, and also just understanding the way dialogue works and how things can be repaired, things can be fixed, misunderstandings happen and they can be fixed, and that's a normal part of conversation. Any of these things that where you can explain your behavior better, and I think improves your ability to be a reflective practitioner. Yeah,
I kind of feel like you both also have sort of touched on a lot of the things that I would have said. I think maybe the big thing is sort of, if I zoom out from like the micro, is this idea that dialogue is something that we do together. I think that that's like the fundamental thing, is that we don't see it as like one person is over here and they're transmitting a message that is untouched and arrives at this person, and they send a message that's untouched, that there's a lot that happens in between, and that the dialogue that comes out is something that both people have a part in. And so by learning things through microanalysis, we learn more about how we do this together. And sometimes you learn something that allows you to open up a door for the other person to see something. And sometimes it's the reverse. You learn something where you can step back and hear more clearly what the other person's saying. That's sort of my zoomed out interpretation. I think that's the thing that's maybe, if I zoom out and think about what has been the biggest learning for me, I think it would be that. It would be to see that conversations aren't something that I'm fully responsible for, that it's something we do together, and that there are lots of opportunities there for having great conversations. And I think microanalysis just allows you to see the details of that.
Wow. And having great conversations, you are also in a project with Sarah Smock-Jordan and Peter de Jong, and are analyzing solution-focused conversations and the miracle question. And you have done a lot of work with solution-focused conversations. So what fascinates you about solution focus?
Well, I know for me, I first got really interested in solution focus because I was already at a place where I believed that language was an important tool, and that it was in the words that we chose and paired with our faces and our gestures that they were very powerful, and that we needed to give them a lot of respect. And solution focused therapy just happened to be one of the first therapies that I was exposed to where I really felt like that was something that solution focused therapists got, that they were using their words and the choices of words very, very intentionally. I had been exposed to therapies prior where it seemed like a lot of the focus was on the intentions of the therapist, or what the therapist was thinking, or how they were sort of portraying themselves. It didn't sort of fit as well with me and what I know about conversation. So I started looking at solution-focused conversations, and I just became absolutely blown away by the skill and the impact that certain word choices could have. And you could really see that in a conversation, like that if you use certain words, it had an effect, and that's what the client talked about. And then the client would use certain words and the therapist would pick that up. And together they would create a picture, an image, or a future for that person. And I just thought it was so amazing to be able to see that. So that's where I sort of became very interested and ended up meeting a lot of solution-focused therapists. And yeah, it felt like it was a match made for our research method.
Beautiful. So what is it for you, Jennifer?
I think I've had the opportunity just to watch a lot of extremely skillful practice. And that's been exciting to me because, a lot of the work we've done is in conversations recorded in the lab and people doing what we think are kind of cool things, like and sorting things out together, but they are still laboratory experiments. And it's been amazing to see the subtle things that happen with a skillful practitioner who's paying attention to language and paying attention to the interaction and fully acknowledging their role in the process. Watching Insu with just like an eyebrow raise at the right moment, or like the way she widened her eyes in such a beautiful way, that could just spark something in the other person and mark something as being really important. It's subtle and it's so skillfully used. Or the way Steve, just the way he says at some given moment, is making it very clear which topic is of interest and which topic is absolutely not of interest.
You're listening to the Simply Focused podcast with Alfie Cherney and Dominic Godat, your podcast for a life in joy and ease.
So looking back on your journey of microanalysis, of face-to-face dialogue, and also of solution focus, if there is one learning for you that other people should know about, because it could also be important for them, what could that be?
It might be something about that would highlight that there's a lot to be discovered. I mean, I approach it from a research perspective, which, for a practitioner audience may not be the most useful. But I think from a research perspective, if you want to learn about face-to-face dialogue, there's like 1.5 million things left to discover. And for every idea you have, there's a possible research project. There's possible interesting things to learn just by what sparks your interest. And I think it has something to do with the coordination that people show and all the places that they can go in a dialogue together and learning about that process. There's an infinite number of things to study.
Wow.
I think that one of the biggest learnings that I've had from microanalysis in general that I would say I apply to many areas of my life and maybe could be helpful to other people is the idea that there is a mental world that exists inside all of us, but we can't know about that for somebody else unless they tell us, but it's not something that we can know. So when I look at an interaction, I often have things and questions, even though I know it's true that I cannot know about what's going on in their brain. That doesn't mean that I don't have curiosities or questions or times where I'm really wondering, what was that person thinking or why did that happen? But microanalysis gives you a tool to be able to perhaps gain some insight about that. So if I'm watching an interaction or I'm watching a psychotherapy session and I have the feeling that the client is very happy, I get the sort of impression that they don't want to be there, I can actually look and see if there's evidence from that person's behavior that is giving me that idea. And then once I get into looking at the behaviors, I can learn something that's interesting that's perhaps linked to that sort of mental impression that I first had. And I have found that really helpful for me in terms of grounding the way that I look at interactions. And, earlier I was talking about my kids, and I found it really, really helpful even with them to be able to see there's times where I'm just thinking, what is going on with them? Why are they behaving that way? And I want so often to make a mentalistic reason for it. And it's been really helpful for me to just refocus and say, well, I can look at what they're doing and say, what does that tell me? And I find that that refocus often allows me to work with something that is actually like tangible, tactile in front of me. Behavior is something that you can interact with. What's going on in the brain is something that is sort of more abstract. When I look at a therapist working together, the therapist can't know what the client's thinking and the client can't know what the therapist is thinking, but what is in front of them, what the client is saying, the therapist has that to work with. So to me, that's the place where it makes most sense to put the energy and effort. Yeah, and I think that that's the part that has sort of motivated my work in microanalysis, is that it makes sense to put the time there.
Oh, thank you so much.
So let's come to the challenge of the week.
I think it could be interesting for people to pay attention to the conversations around them, and sort of when you're at the coffee shop or waiting in the grocery store lineup, to just sort of see what people are doing with their hands and their faces and their bodies, and see how it's connected to their speech, and just be like a quiet, non-creepy observer of what's happening around you, and just gain some appreciation of what people are doing. Like, for example, there's a concept in dialogue called gesture space, and that's the space where you put your gestures that usually exists somewhere where both you and the listener can see them. So like a challenge could be, look at where people are placing their gestures in space around them, and what relationship does that have with where the other person is. So for example, like I always find it fun when I'm in a taxi and talking to a taxi driver, and I'm in the back seat and the taxi driver's in the front. They almost always gesture, and those gestures always exist between us, somewhere up close to the rear view mirror, you know, so like they lift their gestures up. So it could be just fun for people to try to look at gestures and faces with a new lens.
Wow, what a beautiful challenge of the week.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this challenge of the week. And we are curious now to hear from all our listeners, from you out there, what inspired you with this podcast and how you enjoy this challenge of the week with a new perspective.
And please comment on our website, www.sfontour.com/simplyfocuspodcast, and then go to this episode, and also include your gestures, like with emojis or something like that. That's a huge advantage of face-to-face dialogue, where you can see all those facial expressions, hand gestures, and also gaze compared to written or also audio tape. It would be fun if you could include some of your gestures as emojis, and then we could have a look at them.
And a big thank you to the two of you, Jennifer and Sara, for debunking those myths of communication with us, for sharing your beautiful work. And it was just wonderful, as usual, to see the two of you together. So thank you very much.
It was super fun to talk with you too. And safe travels.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
You're listening to the Simply Focus podcast with Alfie Czerny and Dominic Godat, your podcast for a life in joy and ease.